back, friends. It's Money for Nothing, the podcast about music and capitalism, coming to you a little late this week. I'm sure you were all salivating for our hot takes on the Super Bowl, so I apologize that Sam and I failed to bring you any thoughts on Usher and company or the budding romance between Taylor and Travis. But regarding the Super Bowl show, I'll just give you one very late take that is just one phrase often heard chanted down in the capital of the Peach State. ATL ho.
What?
Dude, Jermaine Dupri. Dude, do you think that like 5 years ago Jermaine Dupri ever thought that he'd be like in a Super Bowl? I mean, that's pretty, but you know, well, also, I have to bring this up before we start the topic. I have to bring up the conspiracy theory that no one has brought up, which is as we showcase in our show about Scooter Braun, that Jermaine Dupri gave Scooter Braun his big break, essentially, by putting on like after show parties down in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
And Scooter Braun is also the one who has like, the major beef with Taylor Swift and like won't sell her back her masters. Mm-hmm. And so Dupree showing up to the Super Bowl while Taylor Swift is there, I'm like, yo, there's like a 3-degree thing going on here that nobody mentioned.
And let's be real, Justin Bieber signed close affiliate with Scooter Braun. A major Usher, Usher's really involved in that story.
Right.
Declined to appear.
Yeah, he was. That's right. Because he didn't appear either. Yeah.
Because Usher wanted him. Who wouldn't want?
Yeah, exactly.
What's this conspiracy though? Just that there was tension?
Well, no, just that there was a conspiracy that like Taylor Swift was like some sort of like psyop for Biden. Which I'm like, is it a psyop or is it just you're trying to get the approval of famous people, which has always happened? So I don't understand why it's a psyop. But anyways,
I mean, it is a psychological operation in as much as like, it's an operation and it's psychological. Right. That's not a good conspiracy theory because there's no conspiracy.
No, we've all established that.
And Saxon, more importantly, no theory.
No theory. Right. Yeah. We've established that.
I would
but I'm
put
like,
that at the level of an observation.
Right, but if you're gonna go down that road, I'm like thinking to myself, I'm like, why is nobody mentioning the fact that Dupree's there at the same time? Because I mean, Jermaine Dupri, all respect, it was a little surprising to see him.
I mean, look. I was just happy to see Little John get the national stage.
Absolutely.
He's always deserved.
No, and like I said, ATL just casually running shit by just doing ATL shit, like not even trying. Just like Little John's gonna come through like in the crowd.
I think we should cut this part because this is not the trench commentary that people want from us.
Because moving on, the news has been a bit slow in the music industry headlines. So today, I wanted to talk about Eric Adams, the embattled mayor of New York City, playing a little old political card trick with a little misdirection by his suing of TikTok. But no, you were like, no, we don't want to talk about how TikTok's a bad influence on the kids. And if anybody knows what's a good and bad for the kids, it's Eric Adams, as illustrated by his PSA that he did, I don't know, some back in the early 2000s about how to find a gun and cocaine in your kid's bag. Which, if you haven't seen that, please go online and find that, people.
Look, if you aren't searching your kids, do you know what your kids are carrying?
Yeah, right? Do you?
It's 9:00. Do you know their supplier?
It's 9:00. Do you know what TikToks they're watching that now have no music? But anyways, no. Sam wanted to do an episode on a different topic that he's been pushing probably for well over a year. And
God help us all.
It's an episode on the greatest rock band of the millennial generation, a band with over 160 billion streams, 10 songs clocking in at over 1 billion plays on Spotify. That's more than Taylor Swift or Bad Bunny, who have a measly 5 apiece, leaving Drake in the dust with only 3 songs over 1 billion. A band with over 74 million albums sold, making them one of the world's best-selling music artists of all time. Yes, it's Las Vegas's very own demon-fighting, ever-believing, radio-activating, thunder-causing, milquetoast reform Mormon commercial-ready rockers, Imagine Dragons. We're doing it. We're doing an episode on Imagine Dragons.
We're doing it. I think I've threatened this before on the podcast. Yeah, we are finally, ladies and gentlemen, doing the Imagine Dragon episode. The episode about the rock band that could. The episode about the rock band that is without a question the most successful rock band in the last decade and a half. Probably the only other band that's anywhere close to them in terms of sales over in the Millenium is Nickelback, in terms of hits and sales.
Another embattled
band. But where Nickelback...
Wait. Since I mentioned Eric Adams as an embattled mayor and Nickelback as an embattled band, I think we need to take a quote from Eric Adams here where, despite the hate of Nickelback, they've clearly done what Eric Adams has always said, which is make the haters be the waiters at the table of success.
And that's remarkably true of both Nickelback and Imagine Dragons. But, and this is the fascinating thing that I think the central enigma of Imagine Dragons that we're going to be talking about today. People, rightly or wrongly, hate Nickelback.
Don't say it. I know you
Famously.
like them.
Look, I think that they've got at least 2 killer songs. Okay. This Is How You Remind Me, or whatever. I don't actually know the name of that song. And Big Rock Stars, which is a funny song that would have been a country hit in 2014, but was an alt-rock smash. Also, that song where they get Billy Gibbons on the track just being like, tell me what you want. That's a great song, man.
Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top, for those who don't know.
Billy Gibbons from the great Texas rock band ZZ Top. R.I.P. to their drummer, whose last name was Beard, and is the only one in the band who did not have a long beard. No, but unlike Nickelback, where there was a lot of critical discourse about Nickelback, Imagine Dragons have done something remarkable, which is been without the chart-topping, record-stomping success of a decade, while eliciting almost no critical engagement of any kind. The number of, they get 2-star reviews in, The Guardian and Rolling Stone, and then, nothing. There's not, people
and then sell
there was
billions
this famous
of albums.
There was a famous takedown of kind of Michigan area retro rockers, Greta Van Fleet and Pitchfork.
Right.
This long, vituperative takedown.
Right.
Similarly, there's been long vituperative takedowns of Post Malone, which are, similarly positioned white dudes. Basically, it's a similarity there. Who are really playing for the Bud Light swilling masses from this critical perspective, right? And I think it's very easy to rain down invective on the bands that are producing hits that are enormous in certain corners of the music listening public. But Imagine Dragons, nothing. Zip, zilch, zero. There's no coverage of this band, which actually made, in this weird roundabout way, researching this episode difficult, because often, letting you into our newsroom process, often we read other people's opinions and research, and that helps us formulate our own research. What? But there was none, so I had to, and this is the lengths I go to for science. I listened through the entire Imagine Dragons discography, including the first 3 EPs before their album, because that was the only way to get a real sense of what's going on in this band.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point. There was nothing. Another thing that we do is that oftentimes, because of your academic status, you have access to publications which I don't pay for and don't have access to, and so you send me a list of 30 articles that I could read through before a show or whatever, and you literally sent me one article one article from like like USA Today from 2018 that's like, damn, isn't this band popular? It was, and it had like, it did have some like really good like quotes, like critical quotes, like basically like talking shit on them, which I thought was, it was like, oh, okay, yeah, like makes sense. But yeah, really there was like absolutely like nothing other than,
And that, I think that void is really important for this story.
Totally.
Because I think Imagine Dragons have done a weird thing in that they are the biggest rock band in the rock mainstream at a time at which the rock mainstream has, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. And it ceased to exist in like a number of different ways, but at the same time is still clearly able, that listenership is still there. And so people are able to put up truly enormous numbers by appealing, I think, to the rock mainstream listenership. But the rest of the cultural infrastructure has collapsed. And so talking a little bit about, we're going to talk today about a lot of stuff, but like about maybe a little bit why that collapsed, what that collapse looks like, how that changed the specific set of aesthetic moves that Imagine Dragon did, how that reflects and connects to like rock's history as a genre and the potential of its continued evolution in the future. And what the history of Imagine Dragons can tell us about this weird post-genre playlisted age that we listen to.
Yeah, and like it's funny because maybe if you're familiar with any of their songs, you might be out there being like, are they even rock? And it's like that's how they're categorized, but that also explains a lot as well. But like, yeah, when you listen to them, I'm like, this doesn't really, I mean, sometimes, but not really.
Like, no, it's weird. Yeah. It's weird. It and it may be like, okay, so if you have not actually, and because it's totally possible that if you listen to this podcast, you've never actually sat down and intentionally and with like listening focus engaged with an Imagine Dragons track, though you have almost certainly heard them many, many, many times. And so I do think it is worthwhile. Pause this podcast, listen to the song, listen to the song Radioactive, and then come back for the rest of the discussion.
Because and the reason why we're not playing it here, because this podcast episode will get taken down ASAP if I even played you 4.5 seconds of that fucking song. But you have heard it, and like just we are so sure that you've heard it, and maybe you haven't listened to it critically, but I'm so sure that you've heard it because Sam, for this episode, once again, we were talking about how difficult it is to really find any kind of like critical discussion about this band. But I actually was trying to figure out just how many commercials and like they've been in, and I didn't really find much other than like some vague numbers that don't really mean anything to me. But I did find on IMDb that they're part of 136 soundtrack credits. Which
that's so much.
Which feels no, yeah. I mean, I did find also that in the last 30 days, there's been over 14,000 airings of a Imagine Dragons song. Which, like, once again, it's hard to tell how much that actually is. It seems like a whole heck of a lot, and I think it is a whole heck of a lot. But yeah, you've definitely heard them, especially if you watch the National Football League. You've definitely heard them. A lot of sync on NFL.
National Football League, often known as the NFL,
but yeah, a lot of sync on NFL. Actually, also AFL now, which is weird. But yeah, we've definitely heard it. But yeah, go ahead, pause this, go listen to a song.
Yeah, pause this, listen to the song, because I do think it's interesting.
This one.
Yes, this one, and it's a very distinctive sound. And though they change the sound to a certain extent, like it really was set as, again, this weird, like it's almost like a king without a country, right? Like, which is probably an Imagine Dragon lyric. It's like there's a handful of these mega rock bands, and then just like unclear what the rest of this genre is at this point. So, okay, to get a little bit of a sense, you've now either listened to Radioactive or rejected our suggestion. There's also the version of Radioactive. and this is another part we'll talk about later. There's Radioactive, and then there's the version with Radioactive with Kendrick, where Kendrick just comes in and drops among the weakest bars ever put on record by anyone. And it's always funny when Kendrick is just cashing a check on a feature, and you're like,
Picks up his $20,000 bag and goes home.
No,
Or actually, they probably dropped it off.
it's incredible because Kendrick has the ability and has so many times shown up on tracks and just absolutely embarrassed the person whose track it ostensibly is, right? Like, it shows up, runs the show, and you're like, oh, that's the greatest rapper alive. That's someone who's in the, who, if you put him at number one in your all-time top 5 rappers, like, no one would be like, oh no, Kendrick Lamar couldn't. And then, in this funny way, because he's so good, when he just wants the bag and is almost like, it's not even like, I can't believe that Kendrick's capable of rapping that poorly. It's amazing. It's like I almost like feel like you would have to, the amount of control it takes, like Lil Wayne, I do not think can rap as poorly as Kendrick raps on the Radioactive remix, because I don't know if Lil Wayne has enough control over his creative process to put in that little effort. Like, Lil Wayne gets there and goes off the top of the head, and what is off the top of Lil Wayne's head is often, it's not always the best rapping in the whole world, but it's always of really high quality. And that Kendrick verse is like it's incredible.
Lil Wayne, who also collaborated with Imagine Dragons. Collaboration is probably a strong word. Probably sent them an email with an MP3 track of his takes.
his opinions on many things.
Yeah. Peanut butter and jelly to be one of them. But let's jump in. We kind of giving you like a little framework here, but like where do you want to start with using Imagine Dragons as a springboard into talking about the corpse of rock music?
Yeah, so this is actually a strategy I learned from a long distant feature from the Onion AV Club, of all things. There's this incredible year-long column where one of their music critics, it was called The Year Without Music, and it was really amazing. It was probably 2003 or something. And basically this music critic, instead of listening to the new music of 2003, went back and listened in alphabetical order to the entirety of their record collection, deciding which things to review and which things to throw out, and like which things just got skipped over. And like he was like, I'm moving and I've got all these records, and this is a crazy way to just like reevaluate. And then also at the end of the year, like listen to the whole year's worth of music, which again, amazing. 2003, 2004, that was a conceivable possibility, right? He's like, oh, and then I'll listen to the 50 best records of the year, which is like, now like that's not possible. There's too many different lists and too many different genres. And then he kind of had these mini essays on various things he listened to. And one of the records was, I believe it was a 70s Everly Brothers record, or Roy Orbison. It was a 50s rock person in the 70s. And he called it shadowing, right? Which is basically this idea that sometimes if you want to understand what's happening in a larger musical landscape, picking the protagonists can make it hard to figure out what's going on, right? Like if you listen to Elton in that period of the 70s, you listen to Prince at a period in the 80s, you listen to a band that's changing things around them, it can be hard to figure out like what the general tenor of the music is. But if you listen to a band that's kind of following the trends, you could actually get a clear sense of what that general landscape is, precisely because of the ways they blend into it. And I felt that in this funny way, that even though they were the center of rock music, listening through this Imagine Dragons discography kind of gave me the same kind of feeling, in that like this was, all these songs were kind of not middle of the road, but like middle of the playlist, like firmly fitting into the trends around them. And that actually by listening through, it was like a reminder of stuff you'd hear on the radio, but that you never like quite focused on, and which can actually be like hard to get a feel for what those pop music aesthetics that are really supported by the industry and are really widely listened to, but often kind of don't, especially in this like post-genre, post-streaming moment, don't clearly fit into the kinds of narrative structures maybe that we've brought forward from earlier moments in music criticism. So with that kind of as a framing, and I didn't expect that to happen at all, but it very much was my experience. I actually want to start with their first 3 EPs, which are kind of okay. They all have like the same cover. They clearly are a band, you know, with a high degree of like professionalism and like vision from fairly early. And it's interesting because Imagine Dragons, having listened to Radioactive as a shared set of experiences, dear listener, they're a band that clearly plots a very specific trajectory through a set of aesthetic coordinates and links. And in some ways, that's their skill, right? Is linking things together so that it can both be whatever Imagine Dragons music is and more or less clearly related to their ongoing identity, but also can appear on a playlist next to this, can appear on a playlist next to Dark Horse by Katy Perry, featuring Juicy J, can appear on a playlist next to Zed, or dub, you know, the kind of crossover of dubstep or certain Taylor Swift songs, or right, and their ability to make those connections. And so the first 3 EPs are actually, I think, really revealing because they especially like 1 and 2, because they are the band doing the exact same thing but with a totally different set of coordinates. These records come out in 2009, 2010, and 2011, and they are very much in a way that like is probably important for the rest of the band's trajectory. This is clearly a rock band in 2009 to 2011, and it's interesting that the styles that they're pulling from and developing in relation to are a totally different set of styles. So you have some U2 Killers stuff, right? This like kind of big, like U2 as done by the Killers. Like how do you make arena rock? And Killers are from Las Vegas, which so like they share, you know, there was another band that just did this from this place. So there's that, but there's also like some of the New York, like the pop oriented version of like the New York dance rock sound floating around. Like it's like the
which like the Killers had incorporated into their music as well. Yeah,
sure, but like, you know,
like,
it's
like a more like anthemic, like poppy, and this isn't New York, but like whatever Franz Ferdinand vibe, you know, like higher produced, like multi-tracks, like more anthemic, but like kind of has that driving like. Or like
the Rapture, the Rapture via TV on the radio, who I actually think is like a TV on the radio. I actually think was a far more important band for the sound of quote unquote modern rock than they get any credit or blame for. The way that they took these like dance punks innovations and made them like atmospheric and sound huge, and like those records, those TV on the radio records, like sound like they've used modern studio technology in a way that a Strokes record doesn't. And I think that gave a lot of bands like if you take the Black Keys and TV on the radio and the Killers and Coldplay, like you have this like melding of both indie sounds and sounds that have gone platinum. And like
that's early Imagine Dragons.
And you have early Imagine Dragons. Like, and there's like Coldplay / Muse, which is its own like reconstruction of Radiohead. Right, so it's actually all these strands of modern rock music from the late 90s and early 2000s. And yeah, no, it's interesting just to see, right? And which makes sense for a band on the rise, that you can't go directly to triangulating between all of rock and other genres. Like you have to start off by getting, which they do later, and you have to start off by getting a clear like an audience. And again, like pulling like here's some hipper stuff. Here's some ballads that are like you can get on the radio with. Here's some big guitar stadium sounds, and watching them work their way through that. It's like it's an approach that's clearly recognizable through the rest of their music. But again, because I think they're working on the smaller scale with an entirely different set of inputs into their like Imagine Dragon output machine.
Yeah, yeah, and it was, I think, and I don't want to like jump ahead too much, but I mean, what's interesting is that what you see over the next like 5 to like, I guess, like 7 years in the music industry is the decline of rock, and then like by 2017, like I think is like the official year that hip hop like overcomes rock as like the most played like genre. Like I don't know if it's like by streams or like on the radio, but basically you know, you see this happen over the next like half decade of you see this happen in the music industry over the next like half decade, and like this is like also simultaneously when like Imagine Dragons is like on their like ascent.
Right. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, and so the need for Imagine Dragons to not just pull from various rock signifiers, but to start pulling from fundamentally different genres.
Right. Which they become,
I mean, it's all,
I don't know if it's them or like who's in their team, or I don't know who's writing the music. Maybe it's them. I don't know, but they become very adept at doing.
incredibly adept at doing it. I mean, it's also interesting to think about what those earlier versions tell you about how they go. Because one thing that Imagine Dragons have not done at all, ever, is go country, even a little bit. They go folky, and Mumford and Sons stomp stomp clap style strummed acoustic guitars are important to the sound, but like Avicii style folky, not country. And I think it's just interesting that like that's part, I think, of their designation as rock and why they don't blend into this other clearly still thriving guitar-based music. I mean, and we can talk about this more later, but it's one of the fascinating things is that moment, this moment has also had the continued rise and expansion of country. And so it's not like there's an absence of guitar-based music that is hitting in large, with guitar solos, with drummers, with the traditional, in many ways, traditional rock instrumentation that's hitting in a big way. It's just doing so in country music. And I think it's very interesting the way that they really don't, like, there's no Imagine Dragons featuring JID. There's no Imagine Dragons featuring, like, Sam Hunt.
Yeah, and that's also another part of this story that's happening outside the actual, like, the band Imagine Dragons. That's happening, like, in the music industry, is that you're seeing this rise of country, but you see this rise of country starting to fill the void of rock, which is on the decline. And I think that rock, and the thing about, and we could bring this up later, but the thing that I find interesting about Imagine Dragons being called a rock band is that, like, in a lot of ways they don't fulfill these sort of like stereotypes of like what we consider maybe more of like a classic rock band, where like they're not like party fun. It's not like these like heartbreak ballads. It's not like it's not like a Bad Boys, and like in a weird way, like there's not like a story behind a lot of their songs. Like it's not like an actual story. Like a Bruce Springsteen is like a song. It's like a story.
Right.
And so in a way, like, because you don't have that these sort of stylistic elements anymore, but country does. And so not only does country have like the same sort of instrumentation, but country has like the Bad Boys, or like the party anthem, or like, or like, the Chasing the Girl classic song, and coupled with the sort of classic instrumentation. They have like their bad boys, like Morgan Wallen's a bad boy, they have like their good boys, like things like that. It's like and so I think that in a weird way, it's while Imagine Dragons is like becoming the biggest rock band of the millennial generation, you hear like country starting to kind of fulfill not only this like cultural and like stylistic aspects that like is missing now in the sort of musical ecosphere with like the decline of rock, which I think is also kind of interesting, because it's not like not like we can get into this later, but I mean, like the guys of like Imagine Dragons are pretty like generic, like Ken coming out of a box type dudes. They seem like decent, fine fellows. They're like totally
they're like
unoffensive.
The lead singer is kind of and songwriter is kind of an ex-Mormon or was raised Mormon, has a complicated relationship with that faith. And I do think that like this is also another part of what makes them modern rock in this funny way is they are not a Christian rock band, but there's a lot of Christian themes running through this music. There's a lot of saints and singers and kingdoms coming, and walking alone, and like this very like evangelical or Protestant imagery running through, like modern Protestantism imagery running through these songs. And what was interesting what you're saying about like the rock audience, like what are the aesthetic expectations of rock music that are not being fulfilled? Because in some ways this is a band that, when I'm thinking about what aesthetic expectations they're filling in a lyrical sense, again, which are very kind of personal, doubt, pain, triumph stories. They have a couple songs that are like more pop and fun filled, but this is very, almost all of these songs are about an individual kind of walking alone through a world and suffused with self-doubt. There's very little interpersonal interaction in a lot of these songs. Almost
You took
none.
this straight out of my notes. It's a narrative of salvation of the self, which, like, you know, which
Yeah.
I think, like, you know, and I don't know why, but I think maybe you have a theory on why, but it does fly closely. And I don't say this negatively. I just say this like critically, like it flies close to like our current kind of cultural obsession with like therapy and a kind of correction of some sort of damage or trauma that makes us a slightly broken people. And you hear this in their lyrics, I'll bet, vaguely, about like having demons and being radioactive, but it's kind of coupled with this like anthemic overcoming stadium chorus sound, which I find like very much like part of their formula. And like what probably is, if you're looking for something that resonates to like billions of listens of people, then like I feel like maybe there's something there. But like I don't really understand why, other than like the world sucks.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
I think you're totally right. I think that not always, but a lot of it, it's kind of like a individual and self-doubt, but overcoming, not so much like through the catharsis of a really big sound. And what's interesting there, though, is in terms of the eye focus is and the history of rock music, is I do see lyrically, though not really sonically, this being closely related to the last time that rock music had real mainstream appeal, which is the kind of nu metal era. And those are songs,
good point.
I would
Yes,
argue,
that same vibe.
those bands,
Yeah.
well, except that those were a lot of songs about, and maybe let's take Linkin Park as like the certainly the commercial standard bearer of that genre. Intense, crippling self-doubt and anxiety and examination.
That's not overcome.
But that is sadly not overcome. But also that's often then projected outwards against another person,
Right.
usually a romantic partner. And so that is really angry music. And that's one of the reasons why, like, it's really angry music. And I think that it was perceived, though, in my experience as a teenager in the early 2000s, like not consumed this way, but I think it was perceived, and it has been perceived, it was perceived at the time and has been perceived in the years since as kind of very angry masculine music. Like, this is maybe like the Limp Bizkit of it all. Like, this is guys breaking stuff. And
I mean, Limp Bizkit was fun, but like maybe more like the Stained, the kind type of
Stained.
band,
I mean,
like
Linkin Park too. Linkin Park is angry
Linkin Park too. Yeah,
against
that's a good one. Yeah, for
the
sure.
partner. Like, there's a lot of "you did stuff to me" in Linkin Park, and so I mean, one way you could describe Imagine Dragons' kind of, I think, like aesthetic is a lot of the doubt, but almost none of the anger.
Yeah. Or like, instead of like the blaming of outwards, it's like more of like an internal like something.
Oh, it's like an existential crisis.
Yeah.
It's angels and demons all the way.
Completely.
And that, I mean, that makes a lot of sense for I could imagine a lot of people in like post 08 America, especially like post recession America.
And I would even say, just that, not to go too far on this, but I would even say, like, if you're looking at like their covers also like have like an aesthetic nod towards that sort of era of like, especially Linkin Park. I mean, the text of their name almost looks exactly the same, but then also all those sort of like nu metal bands where it's like, the nu metal bands are maybe like kind of dark and creepy and like a little cold and like metal, you know, like actual material of metal, like kind of looking.
Yeah.
And Imagine Dragons is like, it's like still kind of muted and dark and like weird, but it's like with a slightly like uplifting tone to it. There's a little bit more color. It's like, yeah,
It's also they're all heavily post Banksy.
yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure. Yeah, that's an interesting
Um,
take. Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting.
so
Like, yeah,
so and so in some ways, I think that maybe allows them to have a broader fan base, and
yeah,
even Linkin Park, right? That there's not this anger, and it's not. The other thing is that things change, so it's they're relating to rap, but there are other important sounds that they are relating to, by the time that they really emerge, and I think that a critical part of their story is that by the time that they have their first full-fledged album, which is 2012's Night Visions, the musical landscape has changed. And what's happened and is really just starting to happen. And in fact, thinking about the time of this, like they're fairly early on all this stuff, is the rise of EDM and the rise of electronic music as a major sector in the experience and the aesthetic experiences of, I think, what would have previously been rock's major audiences, right? This is the moment of bro step. This is the moment of like Skrillex Mach 1. And EDM does a couple of different things. One, it allows for the first time, and like post dubstep EDM, for one, it allows for the first time dance music to be big and aggressive the way that rock had often been, right? This idea, like it's like house music isn't fight music, but some dubstep is. And I think that was really important.
yeah. I was thinking Skrillex too when you yeah. Right, It's funny, before the recording this pod, I was thinking like there is definitely like this like dubstep Skrillex sort of influence as well. And I didn't think about how, yeah, historically like that was coming up as well at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Dubstep is the first kind of dance music, I think, that like your tradition, like your platonic ideal frat boy was into.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
ideal frat boy.
but at the same time, I think that also dance music has this tradition of emotiveness in like the long, like if you think about like the house vocal, like gospel music into house vocals into the rest of dance music. And so again, I think there's a way that dance music can have and has a space for this kind of raw display of emotionality that again fits well with this moment. And then finally, the other thing that happens in this period of time is and was kind of a fascinating like rock trajectory of its own in relationship to the changing sound of pop music, right? Because it's 2012, rap is ascendant. This is a moment where pop is increasingly turning towards rap. High point, or about to be the high point, of bro country. So that's like country with guitars and guitar solos on like cutting off one of rock's flanks. And one of, I think, the rock mainstream's major reactions to that is like the stomp stomp clap bands, which is a technical term for those acts. It's the stomp stomp clap bands. We're talking Mumford and also his sons, right? Which in some ways allows you to be, and I think crucially, it's the way those songs are recorded is it's a big driving 4 on the floor beat. And it's a connection that Avicii actually like made explicit in some of those later period tracks, where it's like this weird Swedish take on country music, which honestly I think goes. Like those Avicii tracks are really good. R.I.P. Avicii. Yeah, and I think those tracks were really, really good. And again, I think are part of like in the general, all of this stuff is in the general air. And then what you get is Imagine Dragons, and what they're able to do on that album is, on one side you've got songs like Radioactive, where they are like this massive like head nodding, almost dubstep plotting, but like the kind of halftime plot, like the halftime headbanging of dubstep. with some of the like production sounds, and I think importing that rhythm and importing that vibe and importing that like set of palette, like the sonic palette, a little bit of electronic music allowed them to make something that's kind of rock music, but is able to speak to that general sense of what's happening. And then on the other hand, you've got songs like Demons that are really like classic post Coldplay ballads that kind of takes that like How to Save a Life vibe. It's a How to Save a Life type beat.
Truly.
And just and by doing both of those things, they have like a massive hit album. There's one more crucial piece of this, which is the Eminem of it all. Because I think one of the people who invented this sonic blueprint for how you do like rap and rock together is Eminem on those handful of tracks that he produced with Rihanna. Like Love the Way You Lie is like crucial for the existence of Imagine the Dragons. And then in a delightful piece of a hunch being right, do you know who produced Radioactive? Alex the Kid. Do you know who produced Love the Way You Lie? Alex the Kid. And you're like, oh, okay, cool. This is why it sounds like Love the Way You Lie. This is why it has the same kind of beat that's kind of rock and kind of rap and kind of EDM and manages to draw that line through and reconstitute a like the fragmented rock audience of people who would be listening to rock if there was rock to be listening to, but no one can do it as good as Imagine Dragons.
So maybe sparing the audience a detailed analysis of every single album after that, essentially maybe would it be fair to say to just sort of like that they continue to basically do exactly that while incorporating various other forms and genres that are being popularized over the next like 10 to 12 years minus country.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've done a reggaeton over the
song
next over the next and you know what? And I actually think that that's also a strength. Like, so they basically change nothing,
right,
about that kind of general take,
because
some
now
ballads,
rock is them.
Some because now rock is them. Some Radioactive, some ballads. The only thing that changes is that as I think pop music gets more facility with rap, and you start having pop songs where you flow effectively, where the vocalist kind of flows, he starts doing that and is actually pretty good at it. So like that's the only change. They incorporate slightly different shades of EDM. He has kind of more tongue twisty lyrics ish, and then it's exactly the same, which is actually, I think, in the dog that didn't bark, like what you just said about them not trying a reggaeton song is really interesting, because it's not just that their hit songs all sound kind of the same, they all sound kind of the same, but also like there's a clear trajectory there. But it's not like those are the ones that hit and they tried other stuff and it just didn't go anywhere. It's that they try, like there's some weirder songs on these records, and there's some like more poppy stuff, and it's clearly like things that either they wanted to put out or that fulfilled a desire from a certain segment of their audience. But like, you're right, they didn't make a reggaeton song. They never go do a full dance pop song, right? In fact, they're really good, and this is a remarkable strength for a band that in some way is as calculated and intentional as Imagine Dragons, that they don't, in a way that like late period Coldplay is just like, oh, we made a song with the Chainsmokers that is just a Chainsmokers song and really isn't Coldplay. Or we made a song with BTS that's just like a beat, right? Like, it's just really not like, doesn't sound like the band. And, you know, honestly, like the Coldplay Chainsmokers song has kind of grown on me, because Chainsmokers have a way with a pop hook, but like it really is not a good song. Also, Ulysses and his gold. Side note, Ulysses doesn't have gold. That, like, if you're gonna reference Greek mythology, geez, do like a shred of research. Ulysses and his gold. That's not a thing. Anyway, no, but right, like the sense of like knowing themselves, knowing their audience, and not doing weird stuff is actually very impressive, because I think there's probably a lot, especially when there's moments when like some albums do less well than others. I'm sure there are moments where they're like, Bad Bunny would be great on this song, and they're like, that's not a good idea.
Well, actually, it's exactly what I said. It's because they are rock, and it's not like there's anything really changing within the genre, and like whatever they're dictating it. They are rock, and it's like now they've had their lane. This is what people, okay, a couple things. 'Cause I was trying to do research here, and it was impossible, right? Like, but one of the things I did was I went on X, Twitter, whatever, and like was looking through like tweets, and like it was just a lot of people being like my favorite bands, and it'd be like Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, like AC/DC, like all these classic rock bands, and then slotted right between would be like Imagine Dragons, and you're like, what? And it's because it's like, it kind of goes to what we're saying, like they're just like the only rock band in town, really, if you're and
them and 21 Pilots.
Right. But like, so I think that's also kind of like an interesting thing of why they've remained consistent, because it's like they don't have to. There's no incentive to change. They're and unless you start seeing their streams or their albums start to like taper off, and like whatever, like another style of like quote unquote rock music, if we even can define them as that, start to like rise and become more popular. Like, what's the incentive? Like, they have their lane, they dictate it, they're the most popular band in the world, and so why change?
No, and their double album, and like it is impossible to overstate how many streams this band has. And this is what's crazy. Like, I sort of expected them to have a number of
160 billion is what I said.
But if you look at the breakdown of the songs on the album, I expected it to be the big hits had a huge number because they're being playlisted, because they're being pushed on various formats, and then a really significant drop off. But like, everything is over 100 million plays on these albums. Every single song on a 2 CD double album, released over a decade into the band being.
Yeah, and one of the tweets I saw was like a congratulations to like one of their, like the latest song of theirs that reached 1 billion plays. And it's like, I was looking at their Spotify, looking at like other songs, and there's like about 2 or 3 other songs that are going to hit 1 billion pretty soon here as well. It's like, it's remarkably, impressive just how popular and how like sustained popularity this band has.
So let's maybe talk about like how they're able to do that, because I do think that at the same time as, so one of the things is like, how do they stay so popular? Is that, and maybe this is because they have this pole position that you're describing in the rock landscape, and maybe it's because they're really canny, or maybe, and I think probably both, is like their relationship, their ability to like do collaborations with people that keep them in the public eye in all kinds of ways has really, I think, helped sustain their career. Like, no,
absolutely not. No, absolutely don't. No, that's wrong. Time out. No, I don't think that's right. I think this is a result of their success. I think we'll go like slide into the last 10 minutes here, maybe discussing and trying to theorize like how they're able to do this. And like one idea I have, I think, is because of this sort of thing I've been hinting at, which is this sort of unoffensiveness. And I don't want to say generic, because I think that actually it's quite impressive the way that they do what they do. They do what they do well. I'm sure they have a lot of help, but I think it is actually rather impressive. And like, as you said, their sustained success has been from like basically them not really changing and veering from the formula, which is even just as like anybody doing anything in their life, like there is a desire to like want to change things up, and they're good at not doing that, as you were illustrated with like Coldplay, right? But the thing I find so funny about them is that they, and maybe going back to my point earlier in the show, is this sort of like, they seem to also, and people could argue with me about this, but they seem to also be in step with this sort of ongoing sort of sanitizing of so much culture at the expense of like excess or risk. Like you can see this in Hollywood, where like there's so much is either a remake, undoubtedly updated for today's predilections and contemporary like moral norms, woven into some sort of like lesson or modern parable that shucks off any kind of ambiguity, in place of like a easily definable dichotomy, like a good, bad, like right or wrong, right? And like they're kind of vague, whatever. Yeah. So there's nothing offensive about them, and so like they're not gonna have like any kind of scandal. There's nothing offensive about them. The music is lyrically vague enough with like an uplifting sort of moral or overcoming sort of like result of like you're overcoming your demons, you're doing this. And so what the point I'm trying to make is that they fit very easily into soundtracks and car commercials and the NFL and soundtracking the Women's World Cup in 2015 and these things where it's like League of Legends, like there's nothing about their music that is gonna cause anybody to be like offended other than like maybe and I think that's kind of interesting about them, and I don't know if that's part of it, but it's like they're successful, they're recognizable, there's an uplifting head nodding, as you illustrated, like sort of sound, and then like lyrically it's all about this sort of what we said earlier, this sort of like salvation of the self, overcoming something, right? And so like it just easily slots into everything from a Women's World Cup to a Jeep commercial. And it's like there's also something genius about that, and I don't know if that's recreatable, but they've found that, and it just is in step with culture, and maybe in some way even kind of like influencing culture, but it's in step with Marvel movies, NFL, whatever, just slot it in, and it just works like really, really well. And I think that creates a sort of a cycle where it's like now people want that in there to represent them with their brand. So like the Women's World Cup or League of Legends or like a Jeep commercial, they like pull for that. And like I don't think that's necessarily, it's weird. It's just been this sort of cyclone that I think also helps sustain their popularity. Is that like we know what we're getting?
I think that's a really acute reading. Well, so what you're saying kind of is like this is like a perfect distillation of like vaguely Christian rise and grind culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
yeah.
neoliberal, individual, effort-based, the self as entrepreneur, but like a spirit, but like not just an entrepreneur in a business sense, but like a spiritual entrepreneur. It does actually, because it fits. I don't know if you got to see, in 2014 they do the theme song for the League of Legends World Championship Cup, which is like huge. That is an enormous. That thing like sells out Madison Square Garden for a week live to watch people play that game, and the video is really interesting because they've done two of them, one themselves and one with JID, both of which have over. I think both of which are some of their billion play songs. Yeah. But like the video for that is this perfect. It's like this guy, like an animated character, loses in cyberspace and like gets back up and like cracks his knuckles and shakes off defeat, and then like gets right back onto the computer to like then gets like zooped into the sky. Super, but like it's like gets back onto the computer and it's like this sense of like defeated but like getting back up.
Right.
And
it's all like, about getting back up. It's all this salvation of the self. It really is. It's like the whole thing, And like going on top of what you're saying, if you read quotes from the lead singer Dan Reynolds and these guys, it's the same. Like I mentioned, tongue in cheek about being like a kind of milquetoast like Mormon, reformed Mormon, but this is actually something that has been brought up in interviews with him, and he literally says like, I was a Mormon, I raised my kids spiritually. So he's like not Mormon anymore. He says he was a Mormon, and then he raises his kids spiritually. This sort of, which also fits well with this sort of culture.
He also, and a big part of that is actually a really dope thing he does. Is this huge? He does a lot of fundraising for like LGBTQ plus kids and like youth support, which I think is one of the big sticking points between like. I think he's gestured towards this carefully in interviews that like that's one of the major like belief differences that separate him from the church he was raised in. And like a lot of anyone who's like a major rock star raising a lot of money for good causes is like I believe he's probably a good guy. Like this is not,
well, regardless, the point is it's unoffensive. He's unoffensive, and like even the way he looks, he looks like somebody who takes care of himself. He has like an 8-pack. He has like a haircut. He embodies like the modern.
That's a haircut.
No, like one of those like typical haircuts that you see that
like tight fade.
Yeah, that tight fade that embody like the, I say this kind of tongue in cheek as well, but like embodies this sort of fresh out of the box like Ken type character for like a contemporary culture. And who are the other guys? Who fucking knows? But they all look kind of like on some version of that, and it's this like. It's like I think it really is. It's like it weaves so well into like the contemporary liberal, neoliberal, democratic voting sort of culture, and
so that's interesting. I would not say it's just like
no,
I
it's
would
not.
Bet
You're right. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
I would bet you that Imagine Dragons fandom cuts across a lot of political divides in this country. But I do think you're right that like
they're like apolitical, and that's why they do it, because it's just this narrative of like it's anthemic, it's head bopping, it's like unoffensive lyrics. You're never gonna hear them talking about anything specifically politically or socially politically in their lyrics. You could be
complicated.
You could be an aggrieved rural Trump supporter, or you could be like a urban non-binary like high schooler or aggrieved Bernie supporter, and like you could still listen to that song because it's just about overcoming your demons. Well, what are the demons? It's up to you to fill that gap.
Well, I mean, it's also, I think, then thinking about this them as a perfect band that's like indicative of this moment is that at some level the sense of like being ground down and having things that you need to overcome, and the extent to which that's really widespread in American society, especially over the decade in which they became such an major band.
Yeah.
Decade, but in which really this idea that like they're not addressing problems. In some ways it's like therapeutic music, but at the same time, like I have a hard time criticizing that, because it's like saying like you can't, like, I'm sorry you're having a hard time with the power of this chorus, we can get through it together, is not like, at some level, like that's what music's supposed to be about, like to do.
Yeah,
it's supposed to help and support you,
and everything
it doesn't offer a Imagine Dragons, we've come to, doesn't offer a solution.
Right. No, actually I completely agree with you, and I think this is a good place maybe to sort of like slide into like the end of this episode, is that like I completely agree with you. I say all that, and as anybody who's listened to this show or even a couple of episodes knows, like I obviously have my own personal critical opinions about that culture which I just described, in which like Imagine Dragons so easily fits into and maybe even like influences. But I agree with you in the sense that like I don't necessarily have a problem with that or think it's like anything necessarily to criticize. If it makes people feel good and uplifting and forget the ills of their day, then fuck it. I don't care who's listening to it, and more power to them. More power to them. And you're right. It's exactly as you said. I mean, if that's kind of the point of music. And I admit when you want to do this episode, you've been wanting to do this episode for a while. I've like been like, I don't really understand like why this band is so popular, but actually like now I completely do. Way more than I understand other artists that we've talked about, like Drake or Taylor Swift. Like, like this band seems to kind of make sense, at least for like our current cultural moment, for sure.
And with a huge audience that isn't necessarily being served in the way that I think it once was.
Yeah,
right?
Completely.
Like there used to be like, let's just say vaguely, right? Like there's like a whole, like that the audience for rock music used to be predominantly, though not exclusively ever, like white 14 to 25-year-old
we could
men.
say 35, but sure. Yeah.
35, right? That there used to be a ton of music that targeted those listeners in a very particular set of ways. And there's a lot of music that still does, and there's a lot of ways to cut that like angsty masculine cake. But like the kind of like listening that is, filtered in a very different way through like, I don't know, Guns N' Roses or Soundgarden, which is both about being like masculine energy, intensity, but also self-doubting in certain ways. In a very particular way, that huge, and people are still listening to those older bands that are doing that, but there just aren't that many newer bands that fulfill that set of I guess traditional aesthetic desires that have had this long history in music over the last 40 years. And maybe that's actually thinking about the relationship between Imagine Dragons and those older bands is a nice way to start tying up the episode, because there's this question of like, where does this leave rock music? And I think it's kind of interesting because I do think that if you look at listenership, we talk a lot on the show about the ways in which temporality and changing forms of temporality have shifted styles of musical consumption, and often in relationship to new technological developments. But one thing we don't talk about really ever, I think, is the way that some of those shifts can happen without new technological developments. So I'm thinking in particular about what the continued stranglehold of classic rock radio has done to rock music. Because in some ways, there used to be a lot of modern rock stations. Right. Those kind of collapsed when they went nu metal, and then there wasn't like an aesthetically viable thing for them to be playing for like a decade. There was a lot of indie, but those were already being covered by college stations. There was old music, but there wasn't this mainstream that Imagine Dragons, as we've said, fulfills so well. And those stations closed,
or they became like quote unquote just rock stations, but they stopped unofficially in 2006. Like, I don't think about anybody who's from LA, KLOS 95.5, which was always doing modern rock, and now they're just a rock station. I don't think they say classic rock, or if they do say classic rock, they play music up to 2006, and then they don't play anything after. Yeah.
So what's interesting, I think, is that in a way that I don't know if it's true in other genres, current rock bands are competing against the rock bands from the 60s and 70s and 80s in a way that I don't think, right? You're kind of competing. Modern rappers are kind of competing against the last 2 decades of rap music, but not in the same way. It's just not true with country because the sound has changed so much. Almost with pop a little bit more. Now, pop radio has gotten more atemporal than it used to, because so modern pop bands are still competing with the Backstreet Boys. And good luck. But I still think there's clear like that mechanism and the idea that it has to be new to be pop has changed. But I do think that if you look at like tours, right, which is another major indicator of where the music business is at, there's a lot of old rock bands raking in a lot of money, and a lot of these older rock bands don't have newer challengers. Some of which I think is accidents of history, in that relatively few of the big bands of the 90s survived in ways that could continue to had a relatively short reign at the top and never quite turned into Aerosmith, which is like what you'd want, right? To be able to be touring forever. You want 2 decades of hits and then endless tours. And they all had 3 hits and then their singer died, or they like pulled away from stardom the way that Pearl Jam did and stopped having hits. And so Pearl Jam has like 3 albums of hits and not 2 decades of hits. Some of this is like changing listening habits, is that you start in the 90s having people started listening to rap and country in different ways in the post-SoundScan era, all kinds of reasons. But I think that in the upper echelons of rock, you do have newer acts having to compete with Paul McCartney still.
Yeah, I'm trying
and
to
that's
think.
tough.
Yeah.
So what I do think you get is this funny bifurcation, and this is maybe where like we can circle back all the way to the beginning to think about the like total lack of critical discussion of Imagine Dragons, because it's not just Imagine Dragons, it's a total lack of critical discussion of any of the major rock bands of this era. Like no discussion of 21 Pilots, who also have a lot of major hits, who I actually think are musically interesting. 21 Pilots are doing kind of cool stuff, but like there's no discussion of them at all. And I do think that actually, there's a lot of, question, and we in previous episodes about Pitchfork, about like what's the role of music criticism in contemporary, listening habits. But I think that without any of that intellectual apparatus attached to mainstream rock, with the total split between rock that gets written about a lot and rock that truly huge number of people listen to, what you get is that this younger generation of bands in the kind of the bubbling ecosystem that turns up bands kind of focusing on the attention that they can get, which tends to be from that critical space and those critical listeners, and also just for like reasons of cultural capital. So what you get is a ton of bands playing Brooklyn Steel, which is great, right? It's like I don't know, 3,000 cap, 5,000 cap,
5,
right?
yeah.
And sure, you can play Brooklyn Steel for a week, but like that's not Madison Square Garden. And even if you can do Madison Square Garden, you can't do it that much. And in order to like create that functional genre ecosystem that goes not just from the upper tier indie, but like that middle set of stars, you need a way to you need a way to connect those. And so I do think that this really interesting way is like some of the missing connection you can see in the fact that no one's writing about Imagine Dragons. How could you make another Imagine Dragons? But like if you want music, a genre to function, you need to make more.
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, we were like way off on Brooklyn Steel. I just looked it up, 1,800. Surprising. Feels like more.
Wow.
Feels like more, right? Yeah,
it does feel like more.
It's really hard for me to like ever like clock like just my visuals, like the capacity. I'm always like, oh, like 5,000. It's like 1,800. But anyways, just going maybe just to wrap up, like I can't help but also think though about this like atemporality thing, and also just about how we kind of also mentioned all like the top 50 albums of the year from like all the actual remaining music publications were like all over the place, and everything's just so fractured now. How like maybe it's just like this sort of deconstruction of music into like servicing a very like sort of like niche parts of the population, and like Imagine Dragons serves a sort of like late 20s middle age like white guy thing, just as like Taylor Swift maybe serves more like, you know, a certain age of a certain demographic of like a majority of like maybe like white women and things like that. And I mean, there's still artists that can kind of bridge those gaps, like I think, or like, you know, those demographics like Drake or somebody. But like, yeah, maybe it's just also has something to do with that as well, like that's kind of contributing to it.
I think that's right. And I think that like the kind of splintering of genres into like demographics and playlists. But at the same time, I do think that as much as genres are clearly like co-creations of the music industry, used to structure, used to keep people out, used to keep people in, there are also ways of like organizing sets of musical traditions. They're not the only way, but I do think that they're like often they're useful to think about as a stand-in for those kinds of musical traditions. And there is a question of like, if no one's working in a tradition because there's no structures designed to like support that tradition, like it goes away. And it's interesting to think about like what happened, and maybe it just goes away. Like right, there was a period of time when there was a mainstream of jazz that a lot of people listen to, and it lasts into the 70s, well into the 70s, and kind of like where people who are doing quote unquote like cool jazz are really racking up albums still, but the intellectual apparatus declines and it kind of splinters off, and then there's a handful of people left, and then there's a thriving ecosystem of jazz that continues for a really long time to the present day. It's doing great, but it's no longer like, it loses that mainstream part of like that whole appendage. And I do wonder if like, given how far away Imagine Dragons feel from Boy Genius, right? Maybe what the versions that rock just like of someday, because Imagine Dragons will someday break up, probably. You just lose that entire true upper level appendage, and then everything else is like almost probably an order of magnitude smaller. And then rock continues as where like is as Pitchfork Fest, but like not as headlining Glastonbury.
It kind of indie rock-ified or whatever. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, no more Oasises. Yeah, Oasi. I don't know.
Oasi.
Yeah.
Brothers Gallagher.
Well, there you have it. You have your first ever critical take of Imagine Dragons. We hope you enjoyed that, and can now take this information to your local bar and have a few shots and a few beers and go on a rampage about how actually Imagine Dragons are really underappreciated.
We're sorry.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon. Music by Bird Language. I'm not sorry. I think this needed to be done. I feel sorry for you for the dedication you put into this podcast where you listen to the entire. I hope you did it with headphones. Oh wow. Okay. Shout out to Shauna. And on that, we'll see you soon. Bye.